on an actionable note, I want to give you some very concrete things to do. Here's where I'm going to talk about the trendiness of anti-racism. I will spare you the details of this piece that I published in the Washington Post last summer. It was following the murders of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor during the time that we were seeing, uprisings all throughout the United States and indeed around the globe in response not just to the murders of those two Black Americans, but to other Black people, other people of color, and in response to other manifestations of structural and systemic racism. It was during that time, you remember it, last June. You might also remember during that time, a lot of corporations were like doing all these sort of corporate gestures, giving $1 billion, like literally Bank of America gave $1 billion or pledged $1 billion to Black Lives Matter, to NAACP and Black-led organizations and those kinds of things. There in New York City, Jamie Dimon, the CEO of JP Morgan Chase, was photographed in front of a Chase branch taking a knee with employees to show his solidarity in the movement for racial justice and Black lives. Okay, it was like all these like corporate gestures. Okay, great. Part of the gesturing, and here's where I'm going to make this relevant to higher ed. This was happening in the corporate sector as well as at higher ed institutions. CEOs and college presidents alike were sending the infamous George Floyd email, is what I'm going to call it. They send an email to the entire company or to the entire campus, declaring that the murders of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor were just tragic, that racism is bad. Some would even go so far as to boldly declare that Black Lives Matter. I'm not saying that those leaders shouldn't have written those statements. Members of our campus communities and of our workplaces, be they in higher ed or in a corporate space, need to hear from leaders during that time. The point here, though, is that so many Black folks in those companies and on those campuses were saying, how dare you send me an email declaring that Black Lives Matter when those words are so inconsistent with my everyday lived experience as a Black worker here or as a Black student here. How dare you? It's offensive to write those words to me in an email just because it was trendy to do so, because everybody else was doing so. You know what else was on trend at the time? Ibram Kendi and I are good friends. We've known each other a very long time. I'm such a lover of his mind. And he wrote this really brilliant book, How to Be an Anti-Racist. So many well-intended white folks, some people of color too, but it was mostly white people, last June caught the Holy Spirit and went out and they bought Ibram Kendi's book. It was sold out because they wanted to learn, how can I become an anti-racist? That was very much on trend last summer. Here's what has since been on trend in the work that I do. I hear so many boards of trustees and college leaders say to me with a straight face, our college is now an anti-racist institution. For real? Is it just like that? Like, just because you snap your finger and declare it so? I don't think so. So here's how I want to end. I want to end here by talking about not the trendiness of anti-racism, but how does one actually become an anti-racist institution? How to not just snap your fingers and declare it so, but how to actually do it, right? What does it require? Anti-racism, if you're going to become an anti-racist institution, it requires denouncing white supremacy in all its forms. It requires denouncing racism in all their forms, right? Not just racist white cops who kill unarmed Black people. It's not just denouncing that. It's not just denouncing the Proud Boys and other white nationalist groups, but it's also about denouncing white supremacy and settler colonialism in the curriculum. It's also about denouncing the white supremacy that occurs in a political science department, for example, where the one faculty member of color in that department is on the losing end of racial equity and inclusion and respect for his, her, or their work. It requires understanding that racism is not just individual, but it's also structural and systemic, and that those structures and systems don't reside entirely outside of the institution, but there are well-working systems within it. It requires denouncing those things. It also requires specifying racial equity. One thing that I didn't talk about, because I knew I was going to loop back around to it here when I was talking about how equity work is typically mishandled on campuses. There are these broad notions of equity. Like, you could actually ask 5 people in the student affairs division or in the admissions office or in athletics or wherever on the campus, what does this college mean when it says it has a commitment to equity? You can get very different answers. People are just like, they don't know, including people on the equity task forces. So we do this thing not to embarrass them, but we'll do these individual interviews at times with equity task force members, and we'll ask them, how has the task force operationalized what it means by equity? Every member of that task force has a different answer. And oftentimes those answers are vague. They're like sort of everything. Nobody says a word about race. If indeed you are going to become Lehman College, an anti-racist institution, you have to specify racial equity in your anti-racism efforts. I am not saying do that at the expense of or at the exclusion of a commitment to, say, gender equity and equity for all of the other populations on your campus. What I am saying here, though, that a bold declaration that ours is an anti-racist institution requires specifying that, in this body of work, in this set of investments and activities and so on, we're doing race. We're talking about race and racism here. It also requires investing in the reparation of historical negligence, inequity, and harm. Here's the second time in our time together this evening that I've talked about reparations. Most of us, or some of us, most might be a bit of an overstatement. Many of us, some of us, have heard the ongoing national conversation about reparations. I'm running out of time, so let me just give you the Cliff Notes version of it. It's about giving Black folks and Indigenous folks money for the violence and the harm and all of the very terrible, very racist things that occurred to generations of our peoples here in the Americas. That's one style, individual payments, right? I want to talk about a different style of reparations here. And it's about institutions earmarking dollars and investing in a bold, unapologetic fashion to the reparation of the harm and the negligence that has been inflicted on particular student populations and employee populations over the lifespan of the college. If somebody is asking you, why are you putting so much money into Indigenous things? It's because we have been harmful to Indigenous people at this college. Why are you investing so many things, so much money right now, and so many, so much institutional attention into AAPI students and faculty members and administrators and staff? It's because for years and years and years, we have erased them at the institution as we have done things in the name of multiculturalism, diversity, and inclusion. We excluded those folks. It's time to include them and to invest money and time and resources in an unapologetic fashion to including them. That's why, right? It also requires anti-racism. If we can be serious about it, it requires strategy and intentionality. Look, let me just say, this might be the last time I say this because I just want to make sure it sinks in. I love student affairs, but a one-time program through a multicultural center or through the campus activities center or the student activities office, or even a series of programs through the student activities office, I don't care how good the series is, it's going to be insufficient for the entirety of the campus community. It requires much more than just a program or a series of programs. It requires curricular change. It requires first an analysis of how we hire people, how we promote people, how we admit students, how we teach students, both inside and outside of the classroom. It requires strategy, not just disjointed programs. Something happening over here in student activities, something happening over there in the Black Studies department, something happening over here, the admissions office got their own thing. Could we bring all those things together in a cohesive, unified fashion? All right. It requires curricular mapping and integration. Please do not say with a straight face that yours is an anti-racist institution without receipts. If you cannot furnish receipts of where students are learning about race and racism and about racially and culturally and linguistically diverse peoples and populations and so on, if you can't map it where it's happening in the actual curriculum and in the out of class curriculum, you can't claim to be anti-racist. You have to map it. It requires some stock taking. Once you take stock of where it's happening, then again, it requires bringing all that is happening together at the college together in a harmonious, sort of cohesive, integrated fashion, scaling it, replicating it, and ensuring that, you know, those things aren't happening just in isolated pockets of the campus, but that is happening everywhere, including in STEM fields, including in everywhere. By everywhere, I mean everywhere. Anti-racism requires assessing the campus racial climate. You could do it with the NAC or some other way, but you got to do it. You have to assess the campus racial climate for students as well as for employees. But assessing the climate on its own is not enough. Please do not do the NAC. I'm just going to tell you right now, in as much as I want the whole CUNY to do it, don't waste your time doing it if you intend to do nothing with the results. Doing the survey is half of it. Making strategic use of the data that emerge from those survey results is the more important half of it. I wrote this essay back in 2015. I kind of sort of lost my temper just a little bit. Wrote this essay. It was at a time that a lot of college presidents and provosts and VPs were very desperately ringing our phone at the center. How fast can you get here to assess the campus climate and so on and so forth? And I wrote about how don't call me, don't call us if you intend to waste your money. If you intend to literally pay us to ignore racism, we don't want your money, right? In it, I wrote about how there have been some institutions previously that paid our center rather, $20,000, $30,000, sometimes $40,000 to come and assess the campus racial climate and literally did nothing with the results, literally. Like we run into colleagues at conferences and in other places on the streets of New York or wherever several months later, and they'd be like, hey, did you all ever send that report? We're like, yeah, we sent the report like 9 months ago. And they're like, yeah, it never saw the light of day. Nothing ever happened here. Yeah, it requires doing something with the data, with the results. Side note, the NAC only costs $10,000, just in case you got sticker shock, like, oh, okay. All right, look, let me wrap this up. I'm 3 minutes over my time. Let me wrap this up. Anti-racism requires professional learning experiences that develop racial literacy and skill building and helps faculty, staff, members, and administrators become more highly skilled in the practice of racial equity. Notice the emphasis here on becoming more highly skilled. I have a very allergic reaction to the notion of cultural competence. Cultural competence is an unacceptably low standard or expectation. I'm 45 years old. As an aging man at this point, I care a whole lot about my physical health and my wellness. When I moved here from Philadelphia to Los Angeles 4 years ago, and I was looking for a new doctor, I wasn't looking for one who was merely competent. I love myself too much to turn my wellness and health over to a merely competent physician. I want somebody who's highly skilled in men's health, and more specifically in Black men's health. I want somebody who continues to be on the cutting edge of medicine and who has read things since they finished med school, who, understands, new advancements in the caretaking of a 45-year-old Black man's body. We ought to have that same expectation as it pertains to equity, diversity, and inclusion broadly, and racial equity specifically at our colleges and universities. We should not expect people to be competent. We should expect them to be experts, to develop expertise, and to become highly skilled. 3 more. Policies and practices have to be analyzed and they have to be revised through the prism of racial equity. There's so many long-standing policies and practices that were created at a time that Lehman College was not as diverse racially and ethnically as it is now. Dare I say to you that if you're going to become anti-racist, you're going to have to take each one of those policies and those practices and actually create a rubric through which you analyze those things in a 21st century, very racially and ethnically diverse version of Lehman College. There has to be accountability and demonstrable progress on racial equity goals if we're going to legitimately claim to be anti-racist. I spend a bunch of my time these days talking with boards of trustees, and I urge them to hold themselves accountable and to hold the president accountable. The president almost always, in every instance, the president serves at the pleasure of the board. So I say to the board, hold that president accountable for demonstrable progress on racial equity goals. When that happens, then the president inevitably is going to hold the provost and the VPs accountable. The provost is going to hold the deans accountable. The deans are going to hold their department chairs accountable. Department chairs are going to hold their faculties accountable. There has to be an ecosystem of accountability around this. Otherwise, it's just lip service. It's just trendiness, just being trendy for no reason, wasting everybody's time. All right, here's the last one. Anti-racism requires racial literacy. It requires, racial literacy is this term that Howard Stevenson, and Howard's my colleague at Penn, and I've done a bit of writing about racial literacy. It's the ability to read racial situations. It's also the ability to very comfortably and confidently talk about race, raise racial questions, and solve racial problems. Here at the USC Race and Equity Center, we have these alliances. In the interest of time, I'll just tell you about one of them. One is an alliance of liberal arts colleges all across the Americas, all across the United States, rather. There are 71 members of the alliance, member institutions. Each month in that alliance, we offer a 3-hour live virtual professional learning experience on a different racial equity topic. Each of those 71 liberal arts alliance colleges get to send 8 employees to each of the monthly sessions. These are not sessions in which we're theorizing or philosophizing. We are rolling up our sleeves and teaching faculty members, staff members, and administrators how to do racial equity. We're teaching them things that they never learned anywhere else in their careers about race and racial equity. The practical application is most important to us, right? Low-key, like I have some fantasies about having a CUNY-wide alliance in the same style, the same fashion. I think it could be very helpful because we're seeing it be so helpful, not only in the Liberal Arts Alliance, but also in the other alliances that we've created. We have one that has 69 community colleges here in California that we bring together. The point here, right, is not to sell you an alliance, but to say to you that it's not too late to upskill people, to deepen their expertise, to teach them how to do racial equity. Otherwise, it's not going to happen on its own. I can tell you that right now. In addition to the kinds of learning and professional literacy and racial literacy that happens in professional learning experiences, racial literacy also requires actual literacy. It requires reading things. Here's just a few great books about race and about, various people of color populations that I pulled off my shelf. This is not an exhaustive library. It's literally just 11 books that I pulled off my shelf that I think could be useful as you all embark on a journey of learning together and deepening what you know as Lehman College endeavors to become an anti-racist institution. Once again, I thank you for inviting me back to your campus, albeit virtually. I really enjoyed this experience. Let me give just a final special shout out to Michael Sullivan on the eve of his retirement. Michael, thank you for all that you've done for Lehman College and for higher education. It has just been a real privilege to engage with you during my visits to the Lehman College campus. I will carry the spirit of Michael Sullivan with me each time in the future I come to Lehman College. So, hey, I will stop there and